Hey robot makers, in this video I'll show you how to add an iCal calendar skill to our AI assistant. We'll use some Python libraries to make this simpler, and this builds on our previous video series. This means you'll be able to ask your AI assistant to create events and have them published to an ICS file, an iCal file, and then you can subscribe to that from your mobile device, from your PC, Mac, and so on. Click on the link in the card above or in the description to see the whole of this playlist. So in this session, we're going to look at continuing building our AI assistant. We are going to add some events, we're going to be able to remove some events, we're going to list upcoming events this week and also list upcoming events this month. And if we want to look at all the events, we can also list all events too. And then finally, we're going to be able to save this out to both a YAML file, and we'll look at what YAML is later, and also publish to an ICS file too, which we can then use something like GitHub pages to publish on the World Wide Web. First of all, we need to install a couple of dependencies. We need to install the Python time zone library, PyTZ, and that's because we need to be able to add a bit of time zone information to some of the dates that we're going to be bringing in. And we also need to include PyYAML, which is the Python YAML library. And finally, we need to bring in the ICS library. This is the guts of the calendar application, and we need to bring in this library to make all that work. So how we're doing against our original goals, this is just a quick recap. If you think we originally got the speech recognition working in the first episode and also voice synthesis, we then had a command loop so we could issue commands and it would identify those and action them. We created a jokes and a weather skill, and then today we're going to be looking at the calendar skill. There's a couple of extra things that we need to do next as well, like the MQTT home automation skill and perhaps a news skill as well. And then finally we need to add a user interface skill so that we can actually interact with this behind the scenes through a web interface. So one of the limitations that we're going to be up against is the RFC 5545 standard, which is the iCal definition. It's a very large, complex standard. It's very flexible, very detailed, and we'll only be implementing the most simplest of calendaring systems, or simply being able to add and remove events, and we're not going to be looking at the duration of those events or adding any extra detail to them other than a name and a description for this iteration. So the ICS Python library, this is an iCal helper function. This is going to enable us to manage the creation of the ICS file, which holds all the events. We'll be using YAML to save data and load data between sessions, so if we shut our AI down and we bring it back up again, it can load that YAML file, which contains a list of all our events. And then we can use the date utils relative date to manage date calculations. So if we were to say what's a date a week from now or a month from now, we can use that in our code. PyTZ is a Python time zone library, and that helps us convert between naive dates and non-naive dates, and that's ones with and without time zones. This confused me at first, but it is actually quite simple. At the end of a date or a time, you'll have a little plus, and that's the offset from Greenwich Mean Time. And then finally, we're going to use GitHub to publish our iCal file. This is just a quick hack, a quick and dirty hack to publish our file. Ideally, we would have a website that we can just publish this to, and that would mean that it's always up to date. So the simple calendar class that we're going to be creating has got these functions. We're going to add an event, we're going to remove event. I've got this Parser dictionary because the event class that we're using from ICS hides away a lot of that detail, and sometimes we just want to pass around, particularly when we're saving out to our YAML file, just a dictionary full of those events. So that's what this Parser dictionary is for. We're then going to have a save and load, and that will save to the ICS and YAML file, and then also load from the YAML file when the session starts up. And then we're going to have a list events, and we can pass that a parameter to say list either by week, by month, or all future events. And then to save the file, we're going to use GitHub pages to publish our ICS file to, and I've got a working example of that I can show you. So let's take a look at the calendar skill program. So the first thing we want to import is ICS, and then calendar, and then event. So calendar is the main class, and event is another class that holds event specific information, and the events are held within the calendar. So we're going to import path from pathlib, and this enables us to check for files if they exist or not. This will become quite useful when we want to check, does the YAML file exist already or not? If it does exist, we want to read it in. If it doesn't exist, we want to create it. We're then going to import the OS because we want to do some operating system level stuff, again to do with files, where the files exist. We're going to import YAML. That's going to enable us to create and read from YAML files. We're going to do a lot of stuff with dates, obviously, because this is a calendar. So from datetime, import datetime, and then from the date utility, we're going to import relative delta, and that enables us to do things like 1 week from now, a month from now, and so on. We're importing PyTZ, which is the time zone library, and that's because when we use some of these relative deltas, when we read in a date from a YAML file, it might not be a true date, and we have to add the time zone information to it, and that's what this helps us do. And then finally, this looks like we're not actually using this because I can see there that's grayed out, so let's actually just comment that out. That's a useless line. Okay, so next up we're going to create two variables. One is going to be our ICS file, and I'm putting that in a subfolder called docs. and that's because we're going to use GitHub Pages later on to publish that file, and that's where that needs to live. So at the moment that's just the name of the file doesn't exist yet, and then we're going to create a myfile.yml, and that's a YAML file. So now we're going to create the meat and bones of our program, which is the calendar skill. So the first thing we want to do is create a calendar object from the Ics calendar library. So C equals calendar. Then we're going to do an initialization of that class. We're going to print a nice banner as it says there. This is just on the console so that we can see that it's loaded. Prints a blank line, prints 50 stars, prints the title calendar skill, and then prints another 50 stars. This is where we get some interesting stuff. So we're going to add an event. We have self. Now some people have said, what is self to do with? And it's a referential thing. So if we're going to refer to this calendar object, we want to refer to the calendar object that's specific to this instance of the object, because we could actually have several calendars. We're then going to have a begin time, and we're going to have a name and a description. And I put here the little colon, that's just a code hint to tell Python that this should be a string. So the description might be none. As a minimum, we need to have a begin time and a name. And the whole thing is going to be a Boolean, so it will return true or false. First thing we need to do is create an event from the Ics event class. We then give it a name, so the name is coming in through this variable. We then give the begin, which is coming in through that variable, and it should be in the format, and it's the year, month, and then day, and then the hour, minute, and seconds. We then pass in the description from the variable there, and then we try to add this to our calendar. So self.c.events.add, and then in brackets E, which is what we've created here. And then if that works fine, we return true, everything's good. If there was a problem adding that event, we simply return false. And that's all there is to adding the event. To remove the event, all we need is the event name. Now that does mean if we have two events with the same name, it will just delete the first one it comes across, but it's a small price to pay for a simpler piece of code. We then have to find the event that we passed in using that name. So for events in self.calendar.events, and if the event name equals the event name that we've passed in, then that means we've found it. And then we can say self.c.events.remove, and then we just print out removing event, the event name, and then returns true. If there's a problem with it, we just say, sorry, we could not find the event name, and then we return false. Next is that parser dictionary, and that will just return a dictionary full of events. So my event, we make that a blank list. We then say my event begin equals event begin date name, event begin date time. That's because it's a date time object within the begin. Then we have my event name equals event name, my event description equals event description. And then we append that to our dictionary that we created up above here. And then we just return that dictionary. And then to save, the first thing we need to do is save the calendar to the Ics file. So we're going to open up the calendar file name. So if you remember, that's the docs.myfile.ics. We're going to use W, which means we're going to write to the file, and we're going to refer to this as my file. So we say then myfile.writelines self.c, which is the calendar. Next, we're going to save the data to the YAML file. So first, we need to check that there's some entries in the dictionary, otherwise just remove the file. So this is just a bit of tidying up. What we don't want to do is just write nothing to the file, because that doesn't make sense. Really, we want to remove the file if there's no events. So we say if self.c.events equals set, and that means it's an empty set, there's nothing in it. If that's the case, then there are no events found, and we say removing the YAML file. And this is where we use the OS library that we looked at earlier. Otherwise, we say open the calendar file, write as an out file, and then we say yaml.dump, which will create a YAML file from a dictionary. And then we do self.parse to dictionary, and that's where we use it to create just a nice simple dictionary of events. We write it out to the out file, and then we say default flow style equals false. To load the file in, so we're going to load the data file from the YAML file. So first of all, we just create a variable called file name, and we pass in the calendar data file, which is at myfile.yaml, and we then say myfile equals path file name. We then check if myfile exists, so we can say if myfile is a file, and that will check to see does the file exist or not. If it does exist, then we can say stream equals open the file name, and this is where we use the R for read only, because we don't need to write to it. And then we say events list equals, and then we'll load in from using the YAML library, and for each item in that events list that then gets loaded in, we can then create an event within our calendar. E equals event, and then we say E begin equals item, which is in our loop here. Begin description equals the item description, and the name equals the item name. And then at the very end of that loop, we just add that new event to our calendar. If there's a problem, if the file doesn't exist, we just print out file does not exist. So we're nearly done now. So this is the listing events. We're going to pass in a period. It can actually be none, meaning that we don't actually pass anything through at all, and it will return a Boolean, a true or false. So I've provided a couple of examples here. If the period is empty, it will default to today. If we pass the word all, it lists all the events in the calendar. If we pass this space week, it will list all the events this week. If it says this space month, it lists all the events for this month. So if the period equals none, then we say period equals this week. Then we check if there are any events. If the calendar events equals set, as in there are no events in there, we simply print out no events in calendar and then return none. That should actually be false. Otherwise, if there are some events in our calendar, we can then say event list equals a nice blank array. We have to fix the localization, which means adding that +00 time zone bit onto the date. Otherwise, it complains about non-naive dates being compared with naive dates. And this is where we use that time zone library .utc localize datetime.now. That will get the time now, and we can use that to compare events from. So if the period is this week, we can then say next week equals now plus the relative delta of weeks plus 1. This week plus 1. If the period equals this month, we can then say now relative delta months plus 1. And then if the period is all, then we basically just say it's 100 years from now. And for event in self.c events, the event date equals event begin date time. So what we're doing there is setting event date to be whatever the event date is within this particular loop. So if the event date is greater than now and the event date is less than next week, now that's a bit misleading. I created this variable first. Let's correct that by right clicking and renaming the symbol to be next period. So that's going to update all the instances of that. That makes more sense now. If the event date is greater than now and the event date is less than the next period, then we want to add that to our list of things that we're looking for. And then we'll return the events list. So let's now have a look at a YAML file so we can see how that works. So this is an example YAML file. This is one I've created already, myfile.yaml. And we can see there it starts with this dash and then a space, and then it has a keyword, then a colon, and then it has a value. We've then got underneath that another keyword, a string. We can see there it's sort of changed color. It recognizes that that's a string, another key, and another value, which is also a string. These three things make up a single event, and we've got 4 events in total. Okay, so let's now have a look at alf.py, which is our AI. So I brought in there the calendar skill. I've also imported this date parser. Now this is an amazing piece of code. Date parser can take any string of text that's got some kind of relative date in there. Day tomorrow, you could say next week. It will understand all those kinds of relative terms. We then create a calendar from the calendar skill. We then load in using our load function. Okay, so further down, I've added a couple of extra functions. So I've added add event. So alf will say, what is the name of the event? I put this in a try except block because sometimes when we use the alf.listen, that can cause some issues. So that just makes it so it doesn't crash. So first of all, we say event name equals alf.listen. So we're waiting for what the name of the event is. Alf will then say, when is this event? And we feed into event.begin. We then create an event ISO date. It will parse whatever we passed in there and it will output a date. And we then say string from time, and this little format here is a special date formatting thing which says %y. So that means we want all 4 2021 characters. Then we've got a dash, then we have got %m for the month, and then we have %d for the date. Then we have a space, and then we have hours, minutes, and seconds. Then alf says, what is the event description? So we feed into the event description variable whatever the user says to alf, and then we say, okay, adding event, and then we pass the event name. And then we say that message. And then finally, the calendar.add event, and we pass in those variables. Begin equals the ISO date, name equals the event name, description equals the event description, and then finally we calendar.save. We save that to our YAML file, and then we return true because it worked fine. To remove an event, we need to say what is the name of the event you want to remove, and then again, because we might have some issues removing this, we put this in the try except block. So calendar.remove event name equals event name. It will then try and find that in the list of events. So alf will say event removed successfully. That's what happens there. We then save the calendar with the event removed, and then we return true. Otherwise, if the except block gets caught, we then say alf.say, sorry, I couldn't find that event name. This is the list events function. Pass in a period. The first thing we do is we say this period equals calendar.listEvents, and then we pass in the period of time that we're interested in, this week, this month, or all. And what that will feed into this period is a list of events based on that criteria. So if this period is not none, then we can build up this message. So message equals there. Now, the first time I did this, I just said there are 4 events, there are 1 event. There are 1 event? That doesn't make sense. There is 1 event. Depending on the quantity of events, we either say are or is, and then similar with event or events, and then we just say message equals message plus in the diary. This will all make sense in a second when we run it. You'll see that that very big piece of code there is just to make a sentence work in English depending on how many events there are. And then we simply say alf.say the message. Now, so we say for events that are in this period, event date equals event.begin.datetime. weekday equals datetime.string from time event date, and this little %a means use like Monday rather than just day of the week. Day equals string event begin datetime.day. So we're bringing in there the day of the date. So if it's the 1st of May, then it would be 1. And what we're doing there by wrapping it in a string is making that so it's not an integer 1, it's actually a text string with 1 in it. Then we bring in month and then B. B means use the full name such as August in full, not 8. And then year is similar, the capital Y means use the full date, so 2021 for example. And then time, this one again looks a bit unusual, but what we're saying here is I is use the 12-hour clock, not the 24-hour clock. Minutes, and then the P means AM or PM. And then we bring the event name in, the description, and then we build up a message that says on the weekday plus day of the month, year at time, there is an event called the name of the event with an event description of description, and then we have Alf say that. Okay, so further down here, and we will tidy this up in a future video because this isn't great, we need to work on this. So then we add the event, we remove the event, we can say list events, we can say what's on this week, or list all events.
Hello.
What's on this month?
There are 3 events in the diary. On Friday 20th August 2021 at 06 p.m. there is an event called Fish and Chips with an event description of fish and chip tea. On Sunday 22 of August 2021 at 07 p.m. there is an event called YouTube Stream with an event description of new YouTube stream. On Wednesday 15 of September 2021 at 07 p.m. there is an event called YouTube Stream with an event description of new YouTube video.
So it mentioned 3 events there, it didn't mention Christmas. Add event.
What is the name of the event?
Test.
When is this event?
Next week at 4 p.m.
What is the event description?
This.
Okay, adding event test.
What's on this month?
There are 4 events in the diary. There is an event called test with an event description of this.
That's the one we've just created. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Now I've just stopped it there because I want to show you the YAML file at this point. So there it is, we can see, and I simply said next week at 4 p.m. So it's taken 7 days from today. Today's the 19th of August when I'm filming this. So 7 days from the 19th is the 26th. It's picked 4 p.m, which is 1600 hours. So there we go. So I'm going to now delete that. I need to start our AI up again.
Hello.
Remove event.
What is the name of the event you want to remove?
Test.
Event removed successfully.
What's on this month?
There are 3 events in the diary.
Now I want to show you in GitHub how we turn on GitHub pages so that we can publish the ICS file on the web. So what we need to do is, I'm on GitHub here, I'm in the repository that we're interested in, which is Python AI. I'm then going to go to settings, and then on the left hand side here, down the bottom, we have pages. So I've enabled pages on this. You can see there that it's choosing the source is the docs folder. We can actually choose any folder that we wish, but that's where I've chosen it. And that's all we need to do. So now whenever we upload any content to that folder, GitHub will look at that and it will see if it's a markdown file. If it is a markdown file, it will then publish that as a HTML file. So let's have a look in our code repository in the docs folder, and in there I have an index.md. MD stands for markdown, and in there, if we actually look at the source content, it's a very simple file. It's just 4 lines of text. It says hash space subscribe, and hash means this is a heading 1 style. We've then got the text to the ICOL file here. Let's just change that to subscribe, and then we've got an open square bracket myfile.ics close square bracket, and then in normal brackets we have myfile.ics. So this is the name that will appear on the hyperlink, and this is the actual link to the file itself. So if we click on the preview, we can see there that we've got the title for subscribe because it's using that heading 1 style. It then says to subscribe to the ICOL file, click here, and then we have a hyperlink which is to the ICS file that we've saved. So if we commit this change to our repository, if we go to the settings and the pages, it says there your site is ready to be published at http your username.github.io/the repository name. So I'm just going to refresh that until that turns green. So I refresh the page and I can see now it says your site is published at, and then there's the link. So if I open up that link, we can see it now says to subscribe to the ICOL file, click here, and then there's myfile.ics, and it's already automatically then pull this into my calendar application, and then I can choose which calendar I want this to go into. Now I've actually chosen a different route. So if I go to file, new calendar subscription, and then I paste in that link, so then it's going to pull that in. We can give this calendar a new name. We can say where we want this to be. Do we want it to be on iCloud or on my Mac? And then the auto refresh is how often do we want it to pull new events from the calendar. and then click OK. He's now represented twice because I already had this calendar loaded. So we can see there that that's actually publishing to the World Wide Web, and it means I can get it on any device. So I've got my mobile phone, I can see that the events are on there, I can see on my tablet, and I can see on my desktop computer. So one of the shortcomings of this piece of code is that it doesn't actually sort the events in the event list by order of date. So sometimes the dates appear to be out of order. So that's a small piece of code that we'd have to add in there just to add sorting by the date. So I hope you enjoyed this video. There are plenty more videos in this series to go at. If you're only just joining this one at part 5, go back to part 1, 2, 3 and 4 and have a look at that. And you can also join my Small Robots group there on Facebook. So thanks for watching, and I shall see you next time.